Tunis, the second son theory. They wanted to go get land. Then with more recent historians like Jonathan Riley Smith from Cambridge, who thinks, well, for better or for worse, they did seem to be authentically fighting for their faith. However, you can find all sorts of different characters that will seem to exemplify a pet theory any way you want. So it's a very complicated arena of human experience, like you said. What are individual stories or accounts that you think really flesh out how you understand the Crusades to be?
Well, I think the key is and the key sort of what I did in this book, Crusaders, was to cast a wide net and to cast a wide variety of characters that we could follow through them. I think that's the key. So I really liked putting together, let's say, the first third of the book, which narrates, rather like the first volume of Runciman, I suppose. Stephen Runciman's great 1950s history of the Crusades. The first volume, the first third of Crusaders narrates that first crusade. And so the key is really about combining perspectives. Yes, you can tell the story of the First Crusade through the sort of Norman perspective. You can follow Beaumont of Taranto and Tancred, and then you could take Raymond of Toulouse and have this French perspective, and you could the Crusaders perspective, and you could chuck in Peter the Hermit to have the People's Crusade, the sort of populist wing as well, if you like. But that's only a fraction of the story. You've got to understand, as Runciman did, the Greek perspective, the Byzantine perspective. So I add in chapters that are narrated effectively through Anna Komnene, daughter of the Byzantine emperor Alexius Komnenos, a great apologist for him in having invited the first Crusaders into the Byzantine emperor in the first place, someone who gives you this perspective from Constantinople, looking both east and west and seeing themselves being a rock and a hard place. Then you've got to add in what's the Arab perspective, the Muslim perspective, what's the Turkic perspective. Great character that I really loved right at the beginning of the story when I was setting up the pre-urban stuff, the pre-1095 stuff, was Ibn Hamdis, Sicilian Arab poet, who's basically kicked out of Sicily when the Normans invade and is forced to flee. And he flees to southern Spain, to Al-Andalus, and takes up in the court of the Muslim Taifa king of Seville. And then you can view the beginnings of the Reconquista, but not from up north, from down south, from someone who's got out of one war zone and finds himself, although at the rather nice court in Seville, drinking wine and making merry and reading poems for a living. He's also caught between, in the north, the advances of the Christian kings at the beginning of the Reconquista, and in the south, the advances of the Almoravid Empire coming up from what's modern Morocco, a much more puritanical and fierce form of Islamic rule than is current at the sort of wine-sodden court of Seville. So that, by reading his poetry, by following his story, look, the physical movement of him takes me in the book from the first chapter, which is all about Sicily, to the second chapter, which is all about Spain, because he, you sit on his shoulder. Then in his poetry is encapsulated responses to this changing world. And he writes a very forlorn poem at the end of his life, which basically says, never leave your homeland. You will only be miserable the further you travel away from it. And the sort of facts of his journey show you the shifting sort of tectonic plates in this pre-Crusader world in a way that's much more effective than a sort of introductory essay that just surveys all these, sort of slightly alien parts of the world. I'm a big believer as a historian, and just give it through the eyes of someone who lived it. That's going to always be a much more efficient, narrative technique, and exciting narrative technique than the kind of historian as God survey. Brilliant as people like Jonathan Riley Smith are doing.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. I'd like to hear a little more about this poet and how you think that he represents these tectonic shifts happening, because I think it was Jonathan Riley Smith who argued that it wasn't just for the persecution of Muslims that caused Crusaders to fight. It was almost incidental that the holders of the Holy Land happened to be Muslims. They could have been any other faith and it wouldn't have mattered. And his argument is, in the 1070s, Pope Gregory called for a crusade in Spain. against Muslim emirates there, almost nobody bothered to show up. It wasn't, but in 1095, there's a massive upswelling of people who go to the Holy Land, a much more expensive, a much more dangerous journey, because it wasn't about killing Muslims per se. It was about liberating the Holy Land that happened to be held by Muslims. So based on your take on these tectonic shifts that are happening in the 1060s, 1070s that make 1095 possible, shown through this poet, what do you see that's happening that makes the Crusades possible?
Well, I think, look, it's in some ways it's the case study. This is going to be the case study of the slightly obfuscating historian's answer. So, like, there's your trigger warning. Do not be put off by complexity in what I'm about to say. Let's move from Ibn Hamdis, the poet, briefly to Ibn al-Athir, writing in the 13th century, looking back. You know, one of the great, I think we'll agree, Islamic chroniclers of this time. He says, look, you've got to understand that all around the Mediterranean, the character of conflict between Christian and Muslim rulers was taking on a slightly more religious dimension, in the sense that whilst, you know, the conflicts between Christians and Muslims were now not quite the same as the conflicts between Muslims and Muslims and Christians and Christians. So there was a charged religious dimension to this warfare. And in this, the Christians were on the march. He says, you look at Toledo, look at Sicily, both of which came before Jerusalem. He would also argue, as would Ibn al-Qalanisi and various other Islamic chroniclers, would say that there are specific problems within the Islamic world which explain the success of the First Crusaders. So the fracturing of the Great Seljuk Empire and the emergence of independent city-states in sort of Western Syria, Aleppo and Homs and Damascus and so on, that are at war with each other. And so there's a weakening of power in the Seljuk Empire. There is the internal collapse, effectively slow and drawn out, of the Shi'ite Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, and the sectarian tensions between those two. So the Islamic argument would be there was a power vacuum, man, in and around Jerusalem, and the Franks just charged in. Then we've got to add in the Greek perspective, don't we? We've got to say, without and this is the Peter Frankopan would argue this brilliantly in his book about the First Crusade. He would say that without the call from the East, that Alexios Komnenos asking for Western aid against the backdrop of schism between Eastern and Western churches, then there's no First Crusade, because the first stage is Constantinople and only the second stage is Jerusalem. And it's hard to imagine the march on Jerusalem without Constantinople being in the middle, without this call to go and aid the Byzantine Empire, which appeals very much to Urban himself. It's hard to imagine the First Crusade without, as I've argued in Crusaders, some of the specific nature of Cluniac monasticism in this period, which had made a pretty penny out of the profits of the Reconquista. The profits of Spanish kings had been funneled through in various ways through the Cluniac monastic system, such that when Urban, himself a Cluniac monk, became pope, he'd seen the material benefits of war against Muslim powers. Where are we now? It's hard to imagine the First Crusade without the sort of rising and endemic violence of, I mean, this is a bit second son, I admit, but the knightly class of Western Europe. And there is something to be said in the sense that there was an opportunity here to harness that internally rather damaging predilection for violence among the knightly classes. So here are all our different factors, all shifting, all moving at the same time. And then we add in, I think we have to add in the person of Urban himself. I don't think you can see the First Crusade without Urban himself. We often talk in history about you've either got the sort of determinist view, or, history is shaped by sort of stuff happening, and the great man theory, as though these are like, you've got to choose one or the other. Of course, we know just by observing the world that people, the right people or the wrong people arrive at the right or the wrong times. And they take, and you add all these movements together, and then somebody will just knit them together, and poof, off you go. Right. Look at the 45th president of the United States. Okay, this is just a perfect example. Loads of stuff going on under the surface, and then along comes someone who seems to sort of act as a lightning rod. Urban, I'm not likening him to the current president, but I'm saying like
that'll be the title of the episode. There you go.
Yeah, right. Shit. Okay, but this is it, right? Isn't it? This is along comes someone out of the Hildebrand school, the Gregorian, reformist kind of school, who's also got this sort of Cluniac understanding of how the prophets of walk and how the church, who's also in his name Urban. He takes the name Urban because he wants to be a bridge builder like Urban I. Wants to put back together the Eastern and Western Church, wants to put back together, all the fractures that have been caused between sort of emperors and popes within Europe. All of these things happen at the same time, and suddenly here's an idea, and it's what we now call the First Crusade. And the offer as well, this is so important, the offer, isn't it? The spiritual calculus of remission of sins. I mean, as you say, this has been sort of on offer in Spain beforehand, but suddenly, this is now a possibility. This is the way to remit your sins. You can go on this fabulous adventure. And we can see from the People's Crusade just how popular it was. Then again, having said all of this, I was talking to somebody this weekend who's doing a lot of research into the effects of climate on behavior, and he says, you can see sort of major weather patterns before most of the big crusades, and also a damaging sort of fungal infection of wheat, which may well have given people lots of weird hallucinations for the crusades. So it may well have been the weather was terrible, the crops had failed, and everyone was tripping out. So like I said, this was not a simple answer, and but nor should it be, because otherwise we wouldn't do history. We'd be bored out of our minds.
Yeah, that's an element you emphasize. I think is good to see how strange the Crusades were, that it's this perfect storm of events. There's a mobilization that happens to conquer the Middle East at a perfect time when they're fractured, they're weak. Something I had shown to students in the past was that if you just look at the Crusader states on the map in the Middle East, they're really quite small. And it's odd that this era captures the narrative of violence when 100 years later with the Mongol conquest, it's an order of violence hundreds, thousands of times larger, thousands of times more land being conquered. But our focus is on this particular era, which gets into some of the different sources and perspectives you're looking at. And I think it's good to bring in lots of different voices to the Crusades beyond just Godfrey of Bouillon and the traditional leaders of the Crusades. So some of them you mentioned, in addition to Anna Komnene and the different Arab-Sicilian poets, were Mongol chieftains, Mamluk slave soldiers, Shi'ite viziers. So what are some of these unconventional perspectives that you're seeing from the Crusades that surprised you when you looked at them?
I think the Mongol stuff was fascinating, and we're pushing forward temporarily, I suppose, into the 13th century now. We've skipped from the First Crusade into the point at which people stop bothering to give them numbers, or historians do at any rate. When I first came to writing Crusades stuff with my book about the Templars, which came out 2 years ago, I just hadn't bargained for the Mongols really, and I mean that's a failure on my part, but I cannot get enough of Mongol diplomatic communication with the West, and the sheer sort of grandiosity, the imperiousness with which they treat absolutely everybody with whom they deal, which of course, your medieval history extremely well, as do your listeners, is the hallmark of Mongol success. They don't care who it is they're going up against. They have no fear, and they will treat them all in exactly the same way, with the effective message: submit or die. It's your choice. But the letters from Hulagu, writing, he's in communication with Louis IX, Saint Louis. There's letters going from the Mongol court to the Mongols and the Mamluks. I mean, this is an extraordinary clash, and I think it circles back slightly to what you were driving at with your question. So when the Mongols are communicating with the Mamluks and saying, you better submit, or we're coming down to Cairo and we're going to kill all your families and do the most dreadful things imaginable to you, and submit and come and kiss our toes. You've got about 5 minutes to do it. I mean, I'm paraphrasing evidently. It's just amazing, and it's like setting up this clash of superpowers. And at that point,